San Antonio, Texas, summer, 1841. In the faint light of dawn, a group of 35 horsemen, composed of 20 Mexican citizens and 15 Texas Rangers, are saddling their horses and checking their weapons. The men are angry, indignant, and thirsting for vengeance. Throughout the previous spring, they have lost countless head of cattle and horses, seen their homes ransacked and burned, and, in some cases, seen their loved ones cut down in front of their eyes. Despite the tenuous relationship between Texas and Mexico at the time, this group has followed the age-old adage that the enemy of one's enemy is one's friend. These Anglo-Texans and native-born Mexicans, along with their Lipan Apache native guides, ride now as brothers in arms against their collective enemy, the Comanche. They now unify around the singular intent of their joint mission, retaking the horses that had been most recently stolen from ranches all around San Antonio, as well as killing or capturing any and all Comanche that they can. The group assembles and rides out of town, heading southwest in the direction the Comanche raiders have last been seen. The Rangers, though comprising the minority of the overall force, are the most experienced in tracking and fighting the Comanche and are assigned to lead this retributive expedition. Though they themselves have only existed for a little over half of a decade, they have amassed considerable combat time against the Comanche. They, along with their native guides, had been amongst the incredibly rare few who had fought the Comanche in their own proverbial backyard with any measure of success. Even then, they had not been able to stem the tide of violence that was washing over the whole of central Texas by way of incessant, horrific Comanche raiding. The intensity and severity of these attacks were unlike anything anyone in Texas, from the native tribes like the Tonkawa, Karankawa, Waco, and Apache, to the Spanish, to the Mexicans, to the Texians, had ever seen before. Many times at desolate locations throughout the beautiful but unforgiving Texas frontier, whole villages, families, and farmsteads were simply wiped out. The Comanche had, for centuries, suffered the slings and arrows of oppression at the hands of the more organized, wealthier, and simply more fortunate tribes. Their ascension had come only with their introduction to the horse, via the raiding of and trading with the Spanish. However, once this serendipitous meeting had occurred, the Comanche's rise to power happened with perhaps more intensity and more rapidity than had ever been seen by any tribe on the North American continent before. The Comanche mastered horsemanship, horse trading, horse stealing, and were one of the few tribes to selectively breed the animals. Unlike most tribes that American or Mexican forces had encountered up to this point in 1841, the Comanche also fought from horseback. Raids often took place on full moon nights, an occurrence that became so frequent that a full moon in central Texas became known as a Comanche moon. Unsuspecting settlers or villagers from rival tribes would awake to a cyclone of violence and terror that few would live to tell about. Mounted Comanche warriors who had made their way from base camps sometimes hundreds of miles away would suddenly swoop down on their targets, seeking to take all they could and kill anyone who might try to stop them. All men would generally be killed on sight, or else taken prisoner and summarily tortured to death as equal parts retribution and entertainment. Women would be taken prisoner and generally be used as slaves, both sexual and otherwise. Infants would, in general, be killed outright as their crying and constant need for care presented too much of a liability and inconvenience for a raiding party on the move to trouble themselves with. This pattern had been repeated ad nauseum for decades, and, for the most part, no one had been able to do anything about it. The masterful general and politician Juan Bautista de Anza had managed to broker a peace with the Comanche in New Mexico in the late 18th century, but it had not extended to the Texas frontier. The Spanish government had been long exasperated by its inability to settle any consequential amount of territory north of San Antonio since the city's founding in 1718. They had seen their soldiers and settlers, as well as their priests and missions, fall victim time and again to levels of violence that they had never encountered before. The Mexican government that had taken power after the signing of the Treaty of Cordoba in 1821 had found themselves just as perplexed as their predecessors on how to stem the tide of Comanche violence. In the Comanche, they had found not so much another native tribe to be either exterminated or driven out, but a rival empire with whom they had found themselves perpetually unable to compete. The seasonal attacks caused not only intermittent destruction, but a pervasive fear amongst the citizens of Mexico from San Antonio all the way to the Yucatan Peninsula. The Mexican government's solution was to install a buffer zone of Anglo settlers on the Texas frontier to absorb the brunt of the Comanche violence and hopefully spare their citizenry further south such troubles. But this solution was found wanting when the settlers, thoroughly fed up with the lack of support from the Mexican government, began to foment a spirit of rebellion amongst the settler population in Texas. This became a significant contributing factor in the Texians' ultimate rebellion against the Mexican government, which resulted in the Texas Revolution lasting from October 2, 1835 to April 21, 1836. The Texians would ultimately win their independence from the Mexican government, only to find themselves facing an even bigger challenge in stemming the tide of Comanche attacks that bedeviled virtually the entirety of the territory, from the Gulf of Mexico to present-day Oklahoma. Their solution was to employ mobile companies of light cavalry who would police the open ranges of the Texas frontier. This was the genesis of the Texas Rangers. To be sure, the concept of ranging companies was not a wholly new one, even in the 1840s. The term ranger traces its etymology back to the 1590s, in which it initially described a rover or wanderer. However, the term had evolved by the 1660s to describe a mounted man or force of men who policed a large area of land. Even in their earliest iterations, the Texas Rangers sparked a nerve in the collective consciousness of the time, lending themselves to great tales of daring and do recounted from newspapers and dime novels in parlor rooms as far away as New York and London. But for all their vaunted martial prowess, the Rangers had, at least at first, struggled greatly. Their ranks were composed mostly of young men in their early 20s, many of whom had come to Texas for the express purposes of fighting, killing, combat, and adventure. They had fought and killed Mexican troops and citizens alike, chased down and brutally punished cattle thieves and murderers, and instilled their brand of frontier justice wherever they had seen fit. But of all their enemies, of whom there were many, it was the Comanche who had inflicted the greatest losses upon their already small ranks. In some of the earliest years of combating the Comanche, the Ranger fatality rate was recorded as being up to 50%. Those not fortunate enough to be killed outright were subjected to torturous fates. However, those who had survived had continued to hone their skills as a mobile attack force that could strike deep into enemy territory. They had seen their friends and comrades die in horrific ways in remote locations, with few to remember that they ever existed, and they were loath to let the lessons that they had learned from this go unused. They had continued to refine their techniques in riding and shooting, developing and drilling new recruits in shooting on the move from atop a galloping horse. They had developed their weaponry, moving from single-shot pistols to 5-shot revolvers with reloadable cylinders. The selective, effective, consistent, intensive combat inevitably culled the already stalwart Ranger forces into a Spartan-esque group of highly experienced and highly motivated frontier killers. Though they were certainly held in high esteem by the Texas settlers and citizens they were charged with protecting, the Texas Rangers in 1841 were known as rough men who, without the outlet of their profession, would have found no place in civilized society. The Rangers had no formalized uniform, nor any code of grooming or dress. They wore whatever they pleased and found most practical in the Texas weather and terrain. Oftentimes, the average ranger might wear buckskin leggings with a cotton shirt and a wide-brimmed hat. Still others might wear a serape and coonskin cap. They were often not terribly concerned with record-keeping, journaling, nor the popular literature of the day. They were known to intermittently fight and kill each other with their bowie knives and revolvers in drunken quarrels. They were, by most accounts, more analogous to a modern-day biker gang than anything resembling a metropolitan police force today. Many had unkempt hair, long beards, and spoke coarsely. It was no small wonder, then, that they pledged their seemingly unwavering allegiance and obedience to a well-kempt, high-voiced, and slightly built Tennessean who was scarcely 24 years old. His name was John Coffee Hayes, better known as Jack Hayes. He had been born in Little Cedar Lick, Tennessee, into a proud military family. His father, Harmon A. Hayes, had fought under Andrew Jackson in the War of 1812. He had given his son the middle name Coffee after John R. Coffee, a family relative and an officer at the Battle of New Orleans. He had made his way to Texas in 1836 in hopes of participating in the Texas Revolution, but, having arrived too late to do so, had found work as a land surveyor instead. This was perhaps the most dangerous job in the territory at the time. It involved venturing out into the vast expanses of the seemingly empty, seemingly unclaimed spaces of the Texas frontier to demarcate boundaries of land plots ostensibly belonging to their new republic. But, as everyone in Texas well knew, the territories west of San Antonio and the new capital of Austin were neither empty nor unclaimed. This land belonged to an empire that, at its height, dwarfed the size and scope of anything the Texans could legitimately lay claim to. It belonged to the Comanche, and it was known as Comancheria. To set foot in these territories without explicit permission of the Comanche was to put one's life in very real, very immediate danger. The Comanche had long observed survey parties sent out by the Spanish and Mexicans and knew what their purpose and intentions were. These were the men who snuck into their lands to divvy them up and sell them off to the Comanche's hated enemies. Thus, many a surveyor met his ends staked out to the Texas dirt, as Comanche warriors heaped burning coals upon his stomach and mocked his cries of pain and torment. Hayes, however, had been undeterred by the risks. He had been recruited into the Ranger forces for both his demonstrable traits as well as his military pedigree, and worked his way up through their ranks in short order. While stationed near San Antonio, Hayes had become good friends with a Lipan Apache chief named Flaco. In their many conversations, Flaco had demonstrated in detail the tactics of the Comanche as opposed to other tribes such as the Apache or Waco. The Comanche attacked in cyclonic formations that saw a ring of riders rotate its way towards their target. Every time a warrior reached the point in his rotation where he was nearest the target, he would loose his arrow before his path continued to carry him to the rear of the formation, granting him time to reload and strike again on his next turn. Hayes employed Chief Flaco often in hunting down raiding parties and used the invaluable intel he had gathered from the chief in combating the Comanche on their own terms in their own territory. His reputation had grown not only amongst the Texians and Mexicans, but amongst the Comanche as well. They deemed him heap brave and referred to him as Captain Jack, which they pronounced Cap'n Yak, or bravo too much, meaning too brave. Many a bounty had been placed on his head by Comanche war chiefs and Mexican officers, who described him as an irascible devil. The accounts of friends and foes alike describe Hayes's normally affable, genteel manner, which seemed instantly transformed at the first call to arms. His dark eyes would become icy cold. His posture would become all at once commanding, and his distinctive, high-toned voice would become crystal clear and calm in doling out orders whose consequences would result in the men under his command living or dying. He was described as intensely concerned with the well-being of his men, but nearly suicidal in his disregard of his own, as arrows and bullets flew, shrieks rang out, and bodies fell all around him. These traits had garnered the young man not only the accolades of promotion within the Ranger ranks, but the unwavering loyalty of those in his charge. And so it was on this hot summer morning, as Hayes led his band of Rangers and Mexican gunmen in their pursuit of their mutual enemy. Leaving San Antonio, the party makes their way west, tracking the raiding party to the mouth of Uvalde Canyon, just over 80 miles from San Antonio. On July 1st, they finally come within sight of the Comanche. Knowing that time is of the essence if they are to maintain the ever-critical element of surprise, Hayes and his men make an immediate attack on the band of Comanches, roughly a dozen strong. The Comanche, for all their prowess in offense, often let discretion be the better part of valor in the face of surprise attacks. This case is no exception, as the Comanche warriors, along with one of their women, scatter into a nearby thicket. Hayes, leading the attack, brings his horse to a stop, while seemingly simultaneously stepping off the animal's back and charging into the thicket without breaking stride. Two of Hayes's ranger comrades do the same, and the three men pursue their quarry headlong into the dense thicket. A volley of arrows flies towards them, with most of them sticking into tree trunks or bouncing off of limbs. They are, however, effective enough in deterring the Rangers' attack, as all three men are hit. One of the men is grievously wounded, the other seriously wounded but still mobile, and Hayes has suffered a painful but comparatively minor wound to one of his fingers. Hayes directs the most seriously wounded Ranger to take cover as best he can, while he gets their more mobile comrade to the comparative safety of their battle line. Hayes manages to do this, then returns to the thicket with a double-barreled shotgun in order to retrieve his more critically wounded Ranger cohort. Of the 12 Comanche warriors in the thicket, only one is armed with a rifle, the rest being armed with bows, arrows, tomahawks, and knives. Against one wounded man with a shotgun and another nearly dead man with a pistol, this would normally be an unremarkable challenge for the Comanche, even within the restrictive confines of the thicket. Incensed at the Rangers' rude interruption, the Comanche gather into a battle line and begin their attack, ripping through the limbs and brush, intending to swoop down on Hayes's position and end this troublesome, arrogant Texian once and for all. Jack Hayes, however, intends to kill all the Comanche he can, and, should they not kill him, get his wounded comrade to safety. He waits an agonizingly long several seconds until the Comanche charge is within 15 feet of he and his fellow Ranger's position, before suddenly rising and coolly squeezing off shotgun blasts into the two closest warriors. Then, with the second shot still ringing in the air, Hayes drops the shotgun to the ground and draws his revolver. However, the two shots from the shotgun, as well as the visual of the damage done to their comrades, has been enough to dissuade the Comanches from their assault. This provides Hayes the proverbial window he needs to drag his fellow Ranger to safety. He directs the men not caring for the wounded to encircle the thicket and shoot any Comanche who attempts to flee. Hayes then obtains a rifle and several freshly loaded cylinders for his revolver, before sprinting back into the thicket alone. Hayes hunkers down into the same position he had left, with the stench of blood and gun smoke still heavy in the air. For the next 3 hours, Hayes proceeds to pick off the Comanche, one by one, as attack after attack is made only to be driven back by the accuracy and rapidity of Hayes's fire. Finally, as the late afternoon sun begins its languid descent into the west, there are only 2 men left alive in the thicket, Hayes and a Comanche warrior, as well as one Comanche woman. 10 of the Comanche's fellow tribesmen, with whom they had traveled so far, and only this morning shared the warmth of their campfire and comfort of a good meal with, now lie strewn about this isolated thicket, their lifeblood drained into the caliche dirt. The last Comanche warrior, knowing he is surrounded and escape is all but impossible, resigns himself to his fate. He sings his death song, which echoes off the canyon walls in haunting refrains. The warrior then steals his mind, informs the lone woman left with him that she will be taken prisoner soon, and that she must conduct herself honorably and stay strong under the cruel yoke of the Texian intruders. Then he takes a deep breath, nocks one of his arrows, and begins to maneuver his way towards Hayes' position, intent on at least taking his pound of flesh from the Texians before entering the next world. Hayes, now sweat-soaked and covered in dust and blood, has been waiting. Though he has managed to kill all 10 of this warrior's comrades, he knows the fight is not over until either all of the Comanche are dead, or he is. Again, Hayes hunkers down as the thudding of footsteps and crashing of limbs nears his position. Finally, when the last warrior comes within 15 feet of his position, Hayes rises and takes aim. This time, though, he does not manage to get off a shot before his enemy. The Comanche looses his arrow at the same instant Hayes' revolver sends out a cacophonous retort. The arrow whips through the air, grazing Hayes' shoulder and knocking him to his back. The Comanche warrior is struck in the torso, but continues his attack, knife in hand. Hayes manages to pounce to his feet, and with the warrior mere feet away, empty his remaining 4 shots into the Comanche, ending his last fight for good. The woman is taken prisoner, the horses recovered, and the Comanche's bodies left to the desecrations of the wolves and coyotes. Hayes would go on to many more fights with not only the Comanche, but with the Mexican army, the Apache, and even the Paiute. He would ultimately move to San Francisco, where he would be named sheriff and amass a substantial fortune via ranching and real estate. Until his dying day, he would retain the respect of many of his staunchest former enemies, so much so that, upon hearing of the birth of Hayes' first son, the Comanche chief Buffalo Hump sent the ranger captain a golden spoon as a gift for his new baby. Hayes would go on to become one of the original members of the city of Oakland. He would ultimately pass away at the age of 66 and is buried at the Mountain View Cemetery in Oakland, California. The Comanche, though they had borne the brunt of this particular engagement, would go on to expand their empire, living as lords of the Southern Plains until the 1870s, when they were finally relegated to the doldrums, discontent, and perpetual disrespect of reservation life. The fight for Texas, perhaps more so than any territory in the whole of North America, was a bloody, unforgiving, grief-soaked, and violence-driven affair. The tales of triumph, tragedy, hopes gained, and lives lost are too numerous to cover in one episode. And while all are tales worth remembering, for tonight, they are other stories for other times. Thank you for tuning into this episode of History at the OK Corral. Don't forget to click like, share, and subscribe. Also, if you'd like to support our work, click the links below to become a member. We'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, history too real for the Westerns.